My book is about the puzzling nature of Jewish identity in America and what I see as the challenges facing the American Jewish community. Let me tell you a few stories that sort of describe not only the roots of the book, but some of the ideas and questions behind it. The seed for this project was really planted in a family dinner table conversation in Oxford, England, when my daughters forced me to confront the puzzling question of who counts as Jewish. And in fact, what I have to confess at the time was my own ambivalence about my Jewish identity. I was spending a sabbatical, it was my first sabbatical, with my wife, Dale, and our two daughters, Jennifer, then 11, and Allison, 8. They were both enrolled in English schools. And over dinner, the first week of school, we characteristically asked our kids, well, what happened today? What'd you learn? And Jennifer told us about her new class, RE. I asked her, what's RE? And she said, RE is religious education, and it's taught by Miss K, who I knew was the formidable headmistress. Jennifer reported that Miss K began the class by asking, who here is of the Anglican faith? Nearly all the girls, according to Jennifer, raised their hand. Miss K then asked who was Presbyterian, Catholic, even Baptist, and each time a few more hands went up. Finally, Miss K turned to the class and asked, is anyone here not of the Christian faith? Well, I asked Jennifer what happened next. She said, well, I raised my hand. And Miss K asked, and what are you, my dear? I told her I'm Jewish. Miss K paused for a second and said, oh, how interesting. Then she asked whether my parents would object if as part of this course, we read parts of the New Testament as well as the Old Testament. Jennifer said, I told them you would not object, that you'd let me read anything I want. Well, Dale and I told Jen that we thought she'd responded really quite appropriately. And trying to be psychologically sensitive, I asked, well, how did you feel about all of this? Well, Jennifer looked at Dale and me and asked, when are we going to become Jewish? Dale and I were a little stunned. I responded slightly defensively. Your mother and I have always thought of ourselves as Jewish. We're not really religious, but we are Jewish. Implicit in Jennifer's challenge was, what does it mean to be Jewish? Who should count as a Jew? Left unsaid, but implicit in my response, was the idea I had grown up with. Being Jewish was not something you needed to become. You just were, whether you liked it or not. By birth, Dale and I were Jews. Therefore, so was Jennifer. Descent alone was enough. Well, one thesis of my book is that for my grandchildren's generation, this is no longer going to be true. To her credit at the time, Jennifer was not satisfied with my response. She shot back, you know what I mean. And I said, I'm not sure I do. And she responded, I want to have a bat mitzvah. Dale and I looked at each other, I must confess, a little puzzled. Where had this come from? Not from us. Neither Dale nor I had ever been bar or bat mitzvah. We had grown up in the Midwest in the 1950s in assimilated families. Our parents and grandparents were longtime members of Reformed Jewish congregations, which at the time did not even celebrate bar or bat mitzvahs. This was the era of classical Reformed Judaism in the 1950s. No Hebrew school for us. Instead, like our Protestant friends, we'd been sent to Sunday school at our temple until 10th grade when we were confirmed. Twice a year, our parents took us to services on the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We received presents for both Hanukkah and Christmas, the latter celebrated as a secular holiday with gifts under a Christmas tree. To that point in our children's lives, we had done even less in providing them with a religious education. We had not bothered to join any congregation, even after the children were born. Neither of us had felt any urge to become observant. And unlike the Midwest in the 1950s, at the time I had joined the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, We felt no community pressure whatsoever to join a temple or synagogue. Well, one of the 4 challenges facing the American Jewish community is that most American Jews don't practice our religion very much. Like many American Jews, our commitment to Judaism as a religion was thin. And indeed, I discovered that this is one of the challenges that I identify facing our contemporary American Jewish community. The overwhelming majority of American Jews report they take pride in being Jewish, but with the exception of the Orthodox and some conservative Jews, we American Jews are less observant than our Christian neighbors, at least as measured by attendance in religious services or membership in a church or synagogue. Among Jews, only about 1/3 of us are dues-paying members of a synagogue. Many Jews are not believers. Nearly half of the Pew Report's respondents said they are agnostic or do not believe in God at all. 22% of those who identify themselves as Jewish also reported they have no religion. They were what Pew called Jews without Judaism. That figure balloons to nearly 1/3 among millennials. If being Jewish depended on a belief in a personal God or regularly going to a synagogue, a substantial portion of Americans who proudly identify themselves as Jewish would flunk the test. The challenge for Jews like me, and it's no small challenge, is to clearly articulate to our children and grandchildren what our Jewish identity consists of and what values we hope to pass along. Let me now turn to what I see as the second challenge facing the American Jewish community. This story is about the youngest of my 4 grandchildren, Eli Alcott. It illustrates a second challenge facing the American Jewish community. The name on his birth certificate is Cornelius Alcott VI. With our enthusiastic blessing, our daughter Allison married a wonderful young man, Corey Alcott, whose real name is Cornelius Alcott V. Needless to say, Corey was not raised in the Jewish faith. This was not a big deal to Dale or me, nor were the Alcotts concerned that Allison was Jewish. That Allison married someone who was not Jewish is hardly exceptional. Today, among Jews in America, intermarriage is the norm, not the exception. The statistics are stunning. Since the year 2000, about 57% of American Jews who married wed non-Jews. This represents a stunning change. Traditional Jewish law prohibited intermarriage. Indeed, among observant Jews, they would sit Shiva, say the prayer for the dead, for someone who married outside the faith. In my grandparents' generation, intermarriage for Jews was exceedingly rare. The estimates are that it was about 2% in the first decade of the 20th century. Even in the post-war, immediate post-war period, it was only about 5%. There's now been, though, steady and explosive growth. And in my parents' generation, intermarriage was unusual. In my own generation, it was becoming more common, but was still the exception. And for our children, and even more now, intermarriage is the norm. Indeed, if you put aside Orthodox Jews, who represent about 10% of American Jews, and their rate of intermarriage remains exceedingly low, the percentage of Jews who intermarried, apart from the Orthodox, is now 70%. Many Jews believe that intermarriage is the greatest threat to American Jewish continuity and survival. Until recently, Jewish American leaders, including nearly all rabbis, focused discussion on how to prevent or discourage intermarriage. In my book, I disagree with this approach. While it may work to inhibit Orthodox youth, I think it is a foolish strategy that is doomed to fail, and if anything, may even be counterproductive. For me, the issue is not how do we stop intermarriage, but the challenge is how do we engage the next generation and help transmit to them a Jewish identity so that they take pride in being Jewish and allow Jewish values to be integrated into their lives. Indeed, how we welcome and integrate these intermarried families into our community is absolutely, I think, central to our long-term success and survival. In the reform movement today, I'm happy to report that intermarriage is now approached with the goal of engaging intermarried families. And I think there are also reasons to be optimistic because conservative synagogues are now more welcoming of non-Jewish spouses who do not convert, but nonetheless want to participate in the conservative community. More fundamentally, there are reasons to be optimistic. A recent study in Boston showed that over 60% of the children of mixed marriages were being raised as Jews, typically with the encouragement of support of the non-Jewish parent, who typically does not convert. Indeed, in America today, there are literally tens of thousands of children of mixed marriages who are being raised as Jews with the support of the non-Jewish spouse. I'm happy to report that our own grandson, Eli Alcott, has celebrated his bar mitzvah when he was 13. And Eli is now both the name he really typically goes by, it's also his Jewish name. Let me say a few words about what I see as the third challenge, and that is Israel. The Pew report suggests that caring about Israel is an element of what most Jews think being Jewish means. Support for Israel and a commitment to its survival has long contributed to American Jewish identity. Indeed, it was once thought that pride in and support of the state of Israel would serve to unite a diverse American Jewish community and buttress Jewish identity in this country. Today, I fear the opposite is becoming true. Certain present-day policies and practices of the Israeli government now fuel conflicts among American Jews and reinforce deep divisions within the American Jewish community. Indeed, in recent weeks, what's going on with respect to what had been until 2 days ago, the efforts of the Netanyahu government to substantially change the way justices were appointed on the Israeli Supreme Court, and even more fundamentally, the capacity of the Knesset to overrule judicial decisions has provoked what even Prime Minister Netanyahu conceded was kind of approaching that sort of civil division that almost took on the dimensions of what he characterized as a civil war. The two issues I think that also create enormous division in the American Jewish community are really relate to the continued occupation of the West Bank and the treatment of Palestinians within Israel on the one hand, and on the other hand, the role that the Orthodox, especially the ultra-Orthodox, play in Israel in defining what is considered authentic Judaism. Both these issues, I think, create conflicts within the American Jewish community. For example, there have been ministers of the Israeli government who regularly say things suggesting that Reform Jews don't even count as Jews, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think many, many Americans either oppose or feel deeply ambivalent about the continuing expansion of the West Bank Jewish settlements. Most American Jews would like to see ultimately a two-state resolution of the Israeli-Arab conflict. That is appearing as a practical matter nearly impossible in the short run, and perhaps even less likely in the long run. And for many American Jews, and I count myself among them, I see aspects of the policies of the Israeli government as inconsistent with not only what I think are my American values, but by what I consider my American Jewish values. In all events, I think it poses now a challenge to America. And indeed, I've been asked actually it's going to be in about 3 weeks, the Baker Institute at Rice University is having a one-day symposium on Israel at 75. And I'm being asked to give a keynote address on Israel and its impact on American Jewish identity. So I'm really struggling with this question right now. The last challenge facing the American Jewish community is anti-Semitism. And in fact, I discovered, given the events of the last 4 years, that I needed to rewrite my anti-Semitism chapter. My anti-Semitism chapter in the hardcover book was really quite optimistic. It acknowledged that, of course, anti-Semites still existed in America. But I traced, in fact, during my lifetime, the remarkable disappearance, indeed, I'll use the word disappearance, of what I would characterize as institutionalized anti-Semitism. For American Jews today, with the rarest of exceptions, our being Jewish does not in any way inhibit our opportunities educationally, where we live, what economic opportunities we have. And it's during my lifetime, for my grandparents and parents' generation, that was hardly true. In Kansas City, Missouri, for example, in the 20s, 1924, my grandfather Sittenfeld wanted to buy a home in what was called the Country Club District. It was restricted. They would not sell to Jews. Well, my grandfather was a pretty adventuresome guy, I guess. And what he did was he bought a house nonetheless through a straw. In other words, a friend of his who was not Jewish bought it and then transferred it to him. And nothing more came of it. But I use that only as an example because there were not just in the 1920s, but even in the 1940s and 50s, there were areas in America where Jews had a very hard time buying homes because there were residential restrictions. In terms of college admissions, there were quotas regularly in private schools and in universities. I went to a boys' school in Kansas City in the 50s, and it had an informal 10% quota. There were never more than about 5 Jewish kids in my country day school at one time. That too now has entirely disappeared. There were employment restrictions that were very pervasive. Many banks, many industrial companies wouldn't hire Jews in my father's generation. There were law firms well into the 50s and early 60s that wouldn't hire Jews, or only with the rarest exception. Once again, I think these employment restrictions have disappeared. And so I think that, in fact, in terms of anti-Semitism, in the hardback edition of my book, I really emphasized how, in fact, Jews were very well integrated into American society and really didn't face any serious inhibitions in terms of how they were living their lives. Indeed, what is a powerful measure of the decline of anti-Semitism in America is, in fact, the rate of intermarriage, because formerly it was not just the Jewish community that tried to discourage intermarriage. But in fact, many Gentile families didn't want their kids marrying a Jew. That too has very substantially declined. On the other hand, I think what recent years have made clear, especially with the rise of what I characterize as white supremacy, that there's really been a resurgence of anti-Semitic incidents, and indeed there have been some horrific anti-Semitic actions. You know, at the Pittsburgh Temple, people were murdered. We saw in Charlottesville people marching saying, Jews will not replace us. And I think a serious problem, and I think to some degree, it's a function of both the things that leaders said during President Trump's administration, and it's also a function of the rise of the various kinds of social media using the internet, that there has been a real increase in the ability of anti-Semites to find each other and to reinforce their own attitudes. I think there's a need of continuing vigilance. Now, one paradoxical aspect of anti-Semitism that I wrote about, and I kind of emphasized in the first edition of my book, is anti-Semitism has, over the generations, helped keep the tribe together, because there was a feeling if we didn't hang together, we might be hung separately. And I think that to some degree, I suspect maybe that in fact, this recent increase in anti-Semitism make many Jews become more self-aware of the importance of their Jewish identity and be more protective of their identity. Having identified what I think are the four challenges, let me say the other thing that the book is about really is Jewish identity. And I really want to make two big points here. First, I am not an identity essentialist. I think one of the problems in American political scene today is there's a tendency to take one dimension of a person's identity and to pretend that tells you everything you have to know about them. Now, in fact, for most of us, we have many strands to our identity. If you ask me, who are you? An important element of my identity now, and indeed an increasingly important element of my own identity, is I'm Jewish. But other elements of my identity are, I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. I am a lawyer and a law professor. My field is conflict resolution. I am a husband, father, and grandfather. It's a big part of my identity, my family relationships. And I think this would be true, I suspect, for everyone who's listening to me now. We all have a lot of dimensions of our identity. And I think the key thing about that is, at different times in your life, a strand of your identity might become more or less salient. For some Jews, being Jewish is absolutely the most important. I think this is true, certainly, for some Orthodox Jews, particularly for the Haredim, where every dimension of their life is infused with that dimension of their identity. There are other American Jews for whom being Jewish is of rather minor importance. And I think that for many, as I say, the importance ebbs and flows over their lifetime. A key question in my mind is who ought to be thought of Jewish in terms of the American Jewish community as a whole. And what I propose in my book is a two-pronged approach. For the American Jewish community as a whole, I characterize it as a big tent. One aspect of the American Jewish community that I love is its extraordinary variety. It is a big tent under which there are religious institutions Reform, Reconstructionist, non-affiliated, conservative, Orthodox, Haredim, very broad range of religious institutions. Apart from religious, there are all kinds of other institutions. There are Jewish community centers. There are artistic institutions committed to promoting Jewish arts. There are philanthropic institutions of all sorts. There are many institutions maintaining a connection with Israel. Indeed, in America, under this Big Tent, there is this rich smorgasbord of activities. Now, if you ask me the question, and this is the first question I ask, who ought to be admitted to the Big Tent? What ought to be the standard? In the book, I spend a good deal of time exploring Jewish identity and its various dimensions, whether we're a race, whether we're a people, what those things mean. And I'm very critical of the matrilineal principle, which is the traditional principle of who counts as a Jew religiously. Now, why am I critical of the matrilineal principle? First, I point out, by the way, that the matrilineal principle's roots are not in the Torah. They're not in the Old Testament. The matrilineal principle was a creation of rabbinical Judaism around the year 200 of the Common Era. It comes from the Mishnah, not from the Torah. So its pedigree is nowhere near as solid as many rabbis would want to make you think it is. Because as I say, it's not in the Old Testament or the Torah. My criticism of it, though, is pragmatic. I think it is both under-inclusive and over-inclusive. Let me describe what I mean by those terms, which we law professors sometimes use. I think it's probably pretty obvious. It is under-inclusive because the matrilineal principle in America today would exclude many people for whom being Jewish is a central part of their identity and who they are, and they are living lives thinking of themselves as Jews. Because of the rise of intermarriage, where the non-Jewish spouse hasn't converted, it means that only in those families where the mother's Jewish are the kids considered Jewish under the matrilineal principle. That means that in half those marriages, the children aren't considered Jewish. Indeed, I think the most radical aspect of this, I was asked to give a talk last week at Central Synagogue in New York City. Central Synagogue is really one of the great Reform Jewish institutions, and its head rabbi is a woman named Angela Buchtal. Angela Buchtal's father is Jewish, and he lived in the Northwest. She was raised in the Northwest as a Jewish young woman, and she was both bat mitzvahed and confirmed in a Reform synagogue. Angela Buchtal's mother is Korean, and she never converted. Well, I can report today that Angela Buchtal is probably one of the 2 or 3 leading Reform rabbis and one of the really important rabbinical figures in America. And the notion that she wouldn't count as Jewish, at least based on her birth alone, I find pretty appalling. At the other extreme, it's over-inclusive. And there, I discuss in my book the case of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright had 4 Jewish grandparents. Both her parents were Jewish, but her parents converted when she was a young girl after they had moved from Czechoslovakia to England. She was raised as a Catholic. She married an Anglican and became Episcopalian. And apparently, during her whole youth, she was never told by her parents about her Jewish heritage. The notion that because she was born a Jew, she necessarily always should be characterized as a Jew, and somehow had betrayed the Jewish people, I find wrong-headed. I have to confess, and I say this in the book, I suspect, given that her father had been a diplomat and that she was interested in international relations, I find there was an element perhaps of willful ignorance in terms of her growing up years, not being more curious about her grandparents, what happened to them, et cetera. But on the other hand, I think, and I ask myself, why should she feel any obligation to think of herself as Jewish when in terms of religion, she wasn't, and she had been raised as she had been raised? In that sense, I think the matrilineal standard is over-inclusive because it characterizes people as Jewish, whether or not they even know of their Jewish background. Well, in all events, under the Mnookin two-pronged test, to be admitted to the big tent, all I would require is that someone publicly acknowledge and declare that they're Jewish. I'm not going to quiz them on whether or not they had a religious conversion or who their mother or father was. Welcome to the big tent. A second prong, though, of my standard would say that the institutions under the big tent could each have whatever standard they wanted. An Orthodox synagogue certainly has the right to continue to insist that they would only consider someone as Jewish, particularly for purposes of membership, if they either had a mother who was Jewish or had undergone an Orthodox conversion. In other words, the institutions under the big tent could set their own standards. But for admission to the big tent itself, I would not allow the Orthodox to set the standard for the whole big tent. Indeed, I suspect there are Jewish community centers that never even ask anybody what their religion is if they want to become members. And there are Jewish philanthropies that, of course, will gladly accept contributions from people without checking what their religion is first. So that's because, in fact, one of the things that I think is wonderful about America is there's this rich diversity under the big tent. And under that big tent, some people will nibble, others will feast, but it's going to be an individual choice. Let me conclude by what I see as a really substantial challenge, though, and that is, although my standard alone isn't going to do enough, because I think a critical aspect of is how do we encourage the next generation not only to think of themselves as Jewish, but to have that identity somehow inform how they live their lives. And as I said at the outset, if one is religious, the answer of how that happens is comparatively easy. For those of us who aren't religious, it remains a challenge. And when my grandchildren ask me, what are the key elements in my own mind to thinking of myself as Jewish? I say three things: the Jewish head, the Jewish heart, and the Jewish heritage. And let me conclude by just saying a word about each. By Jewish head, I mean we are the people of the book. Our culture has long cherished education, argument, and learning. And a very important aspect to me of my Jewish identity is that commitment to learning. A second dimension is what I call the Jewish heart. Although the religious education I received at Temple B'nai Yehuda in Kansas City, Missouri, which was then classically reformed, was very thin. The one thing I did learn was our people's commitment to healing the world, tikkun olam, And the Reform Jewish movement has long emphasized that obligation to help heal not only other Jews that might be in need, but other peoples in the world as a whole. And I cherish that dimension of my Jewish identity. And the last element is what I call the Jewish heritage. The history of our people, including the extraordinarily interesting history of the American Jewish community, which I had the privilege of really learning a great deal more about and writing about in my book, is really a quite remarkable story. And it's a complicated story. I mean, indeed, the high water mark for anti-Semitism in America was really between 1900 and the end of World War II. It was fairly recent. But in all events, I think the story of Jews in this country is a stunningly important and interesting story, and one we should take great pride in, as well as, of course, our 3,000-year history. Thanks a lot. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Please feel free to chat your questions. We have a little bit of time. So I told the professor, since he's a Harvard Law School professor and he's an expert in negotiation, I feel very comfortable going at him with anything I want to ask that's challenging. I wouldn't do it to any normal speaker, but I'm going to do it to you. I will start by saying that, of course, CSP is about Jewish education. And we spend a lot of time learning about every aspect of Judaism. We really do. We cover everything. We do history, philosophy, theology, archaeology. And the people online here are getting a master's degree in Jewish education. So I wanted to thank them for joining us and learning with us. Number two is that this is the big week for Israel in American synagogues. All of you need to go to your synagogue, either online or in person, and see what your rabbi or clergy has to say about Israel and what happened, and report back to me if anything interesting happens. Because you all know that Israel is the third rail. It's very hard to talk about it in the synagogue, but if your clergy doesn't talk about it, I think that's a big mistake. When we were in Israel for one of our CSP adventures, we met with Hillel Halkin, who's a Zionist who made Aliyah, I think, in the 60s, and he told us something. He said to our audience, it's our first night. I don't know if Marion Brackett was there, I forget, but he said that he would rather have his daughter marry, or his son marry, a non-Jewish person and live in Israel than marry a Jewish person and live in New York, because there's no future for Judaism in America. Now, you've written this whole book. This book is very introspective. It's filled with your own personal stories and your own delving into Judaism. How do you respond to that comment, given everything you've told us about what you think is there a future for Jews in America?
Well, first, I think it's wrong and absurd. There, of course, is a future for Jews in America. I think that the question is, will our community retain its variety and vitality? And on that, I think that there are issues, but especially in New York, I don't think it's going to be a big problem. The other thing, which I think it's important to note, this person's trope that there's no future for Judaism in America is an old Zionist trope. The Zionist view has long been that without Aliyah, that Israel not only was critical to survival, but that we Jews in the diaspora were doomed in one of two ways. Either anti-Semitism was going to do us in, or we would assimilate away. And in fact, in Israel, although most Zionists don't explicitly state it as strongly as this man did to your group, it's a very common trope that in the US, because of intermarriage, we're going to disappear. And that, in fact, they also, of course, will also describe how, given that anti-Semitism is on the rise, that too creates threats. But I think, in fact, it is not the case. And I think that looking at your program is an example of how wrong he is. In the American Jewish world today, the thirst for adult Jews for additional education relating to their Jewish heritage today is stunning. There are synagogues where it's interesting. There are more people taking a class on the Talmud, an educational class on the Talmud, than there are attending services. And that educational programs around the country directed at Jews are booming. You're not an exception in this regard. You're part of that process. And I think that I think you told me you've had 500 speakers in your series in Orange County.
Well, in Orange County, we've been around for 22 years. We've done about 1,000 programs, including the 576 online for now our global community that you're meeting with here.
Well, I mean, anyway, I think
So,
I've made my point.
Well, we don't call ourselves an exception. We just say we're exceptional.
But that's fair enough.
Okay, we don't do that. We're not that. We're
Well,
not that haughty. So here's the question.
Every child is exceptional. We all know that, right?
That's true. So how has writing the book changed you in whether it's in your Judaism or in any other aspect? Because you spent a lot of time, I assume. How long did it take you to write the book, I guess?
4 years.
And 4 years to write it. So you spent a lot of time researching and writing it. How did the writing of the book change you, I guess, in your Jewish practice or any other way?
It didn't change me in terms of my own religious practices. I wish it had. I mean, in fact, I say in the book that I sort of wish our liturgy emotionally connected with me more than it does. But I'm being honest when I say it doesn't very much. And indeed, when I read the translation of much of our services, some of it sometimes puts my teeth on edge. On the other hand, I've developed a much deeper and greater appreciation of the history of our people, of the struggles of our people. I think of the values of our people. I've gotten to know, because of working on this book, I've been exposed to the stunning variety of the way people express their Judaism in America. At Harvard Law School, probably beginning 15 or so years ago, we started admitting some young men who, although they had attended the yeshiva, never had a college degree. They took the LSAT, and now it turns out yeshivas often give a degree of some sort, so they don't exactly have the same problem. But in my teaching, I've gotten to know something I never knew personally. Growing up in Kansas City or in my life in college or law school, I never got to know on a personal level any Haredim. I use that term because they prefer it to ultra-Orthodox. It's been absolutely fascinating. In fact, while I was writing this book, Ari, it might amuse you to know that at the law school, you know, as a tenured professor, you can give a seminar on almost anything you want. It doesn't have to be very strictly law related. And I gave a seminar on American Jewish identity. And there was limited 24 kids, and there were always a number of non-Jewish students in it. And we had the full range of Jewish kids, including several Haredim. And it was a fabulous experience, I think, for me. And they said for them too, because although they sure as hell know an awful lot about the Talmud, the Mishnah, they didn't know anything about American Jewish history. And they didn't know very much about Jewish history, period. Other than, of course, there'd been a lot of anti-Semitism. over the years. And indeed, an amusing time in the class is when I said that historically among Orthodox Jews, many marriages were arranged marriages, formerly. And one student piped up and said, formerly? I get emails from a matchmaker every week sending me resumes. I go to New York every week from Cambridge, sending me resumes. And some women in the class said, resumes? And he said, yes. And he showed them, these, and these other kids were saying, oh, she's very attractive. And one guy who was also Haredim says, oh, I know her brother. But it was, anyway, it was an interesting experience for all of us. And my journey in writing the book, I loved those dimensions of it. Learning more.
Right. Those are great stories. Since you mentioned the Haredim, how do they do in your law school classes, given their background? Because some people argue that if you grow up in a Haredi world and you're educated in a certain way, and you're not spending your time watching television and movies, you're actually really sharpening your mind, and therefore you could be a great student, like in a Harvard Law School class, or you may not have been exposed to so much, you'd be limited. Did you find the Haredi students to be great students or limited?
Both. Many were very good students. They, of course, had been, in ways, reading law. They were often pretty good at textual analysis. Their background in terms of the social sciences and history was often pretty thin, but they were quick learners. I mean, these kids were obviously very bright and hardworking, and they've done fine. And a number of them now, I mean, this is another element of it. I've had Haredim, students of mine, several hired by law firms that 30 years ago wouldn't hire any Jew. And these young people, of course, go to the law firms and say, during the Sabbath, it's clear they're not going to work, right? They might work on Sunday, but they're not going to work from sundown to sunset, during the Sabbath, and from sundown to sundown during the Sabbath. And so I think it's an interesting story.
People have been asking questions. They see that you took on a personal journey to explore your Judaism based on the stories you told us about your daughter, your grandchildren. But, the average Jewish American who's not associated or affiliated with a synagogue, who may not even be associated with the Jewish Community Center, may really be culturally Jewish, how do they learn about their Judaism and teach their kids about Judaism? Because Judaism is, as I think you've outlined, is more than just, a right by birth, right? It's more than that.
I think I completely agree. Education is indispensable. And in my book, for example, first I have to say a good part of the book's pretty academic, because I really go through the issues of who's a Jew in Israel and issues about race and peoplehood in some detail. But the other thing I do in the book, at the end of the book, and it's particularly addressed to the kinds of folks you're describing, is, well, how do you go about raising a Jewish child, particularly if you're not particularly religious? Well, one thing I encourage them to do, and I'm explicit about it, is you better join a temple or synagogue. Because without education, it's not going to happen automatically. And I think the other thing that's critical, of course, is celebrating some Jewish holidays or traditions within the home. I think there's pretty good evidence that what is most impactful on young people is when they participate with their parents in some Jewish activities. And, one bit of good news is Passover, of course, for American Jews is a very big deal. It is really perhaps the most celebrated holiday in many ways. And many of us celebrate it as a holiday, a celebration of freedom, and its lessons about slavery at all. But I think celebrating things in the home are very, very valuable. It pleased me. Well, I must say, I regret that when our kids were young, we didn't celebrate Shabbat in our home. I view that as a personal failing. But it sort of all came a little late because it was triggered and I told him the story.
Right.
But education's critical, and it's also never too late, in the sense that I learned the most when I began writing this book. I was in my 70s. So it's never too late.
I would add that summer camp is also a great opportunity if you can afford it and get your kids to a Jewish summer camp. But this is, the audience you're talking to here. The audience you're talking to here is not the audience you need to be talking to. So let me ask a question. What's the reaction been to your book? And have you delivered this book to an audience of Jews who don't know Judaism, and what was their reaction to it?
Well, in fact, one of the things that has been most moving to me is many people have approached me who've read the book, who grew up as I did, have children who have intermarried, have felt uneasy about their own relationship to Judaism and what's going on with the next generation or two, and felt very nourished and encouraged by my book. And that to me was thrilling, because that I may have made a difference in that way, and that I spoke to them, I think is useful. And I think I've also been encouraged because a number of rabbis have said that they have even assigned my book to young people along the way because they thought it had useful messages. So I think the reception in that respect has been very good. Many people I'm not an AIPAC supporter. I'm a J Street person, okay? I make no bones about that. In fact, I've done a fair amount of work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Israel, working to try to dampen the conflict among Jews. By the way, my primary theory as someone in dispute resolution is the biggest barrier to a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today are the internal conflicts within Israel among Jews on the one hand, and the internal conflicts among Palestinians on the other. Those internal conflicts make it extraordinarily challenging for a leader on either side to try to put together the coalition to make the compromises that would be necessary. And so I think that I've spent a fair amount of energy studying that conflict, and as I say, I've done some work that I could describe, but I won't now, on trying to diminish the internal conflict among Jews in Israel. I did that work during the time that Prime Minister Sharon had proposed and then successfully withdrew the Jewish settlements from Gaza. And I did it in a dialogue group among Israelis, all Israeli Jews, but ranging from Haredim on the one hand to a founder of Peace Now on the other. The other chapter that's been controversial is the chapter on anti-Semitism, because in fact, as I noted, the original draft in the hard copy book, I have to admit, it turned out to be a bit too optimistic.
Yeah. Well, that's unfortunate that you have when your paperback. People have asked. The paperback is out. I know it's available on Amazon as a follow-up to this program, to our programs. I always send links so that the link to the book will be in there. And I guess do not buy the hardcover because it will have a different chapter on anti-Semitism than the paperback. So I will share the link with you all. And it's 1:30 exactly. Professor Mnookin, it's been a pleasure having you with us from CSP, sharing your personal stories, your stories about the book, and love to have you back to talk to you about your suggested solution to the current crisis in Israel as a negotiator. If we flew you to Israel, if Neil Eisenberg accompanies you on LL, he'll put you in business class. Don't worry, next to him. How would you get to a negotiated settlement? Is it? I'll ask it this way: do you think there's a possible negotiated settlement to the current situation in Israel with the government, with the extreme right-wing government, and what they want to pass, and what seems like a majority of Israelis that don't want it to pass? Is there a way forward? Is the question. You probably will say there's always a way forward, but I'm asking kind of your honest opinion, given that you are a negotiator.
My honest opinion is that there are a variety of compromises available to settle the issues relating to the court. And I would predict with some confidence that that one is going to get resolved. What's not being discussed very much, though, of course, are the remaining issues with respect to West Bank settlements, or with the influence of the Haredim over being able to define what authentic Judaism is in Israel.
Okay, well, we'll take what we can get. Let's try to avoid the civil war, and we'll get to the internal wars at other points. We have many more years, hopefully, to resolve those issues. So thank you so much, Professor Mnookin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Go back to your Passover prep, and what a pleasure. Okay, thank you again. Take care. Nice to see everybody. Have a great day. Be safe. See you on Sunday in Tunisia.